Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see all of you on a Friday midday. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Charlton McIlwain, who is the Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication and Vice Provost for Faculty Engagement and Development at NYU. His scholarly work focuses on the intersections of race, media, and racial justice activism. He is the founder of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies and oversees the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology, which brings together NYU's faculty experts to collaborate with each other and with partners in the public and private sectors on the ethical creation, use, and governance of technology in society. He is NYU's, you are busy. Thank you for coming to Duke. We really appreciate this. He is NYU's designee to the New America Ford Foundation-sponsored Public Interest Technology University Network. The author of numerous publications, he's the author of numerous publications, including the book, Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice, From the Afronet to Black Lives Matter, published by Oxford University Press, and the co-author of Race Appeal, How Political Candidates Invoke Race in U.S. Political Campaigns, a timely topic. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to Duke University.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to try something popped up on the screen here. Let's see if it'll go away. Okay, perfect. Thank you all. I want to try to see who's in the room. I saw an influx of people. Everyone's law students? Okay, perfect. So I think I want to start off saying thank you to Trina, to Gio, to all the folks who invited me here today. I think you could hear in the bio that I'm not sure if I'm the only one. I might be the only person in this symposium today who is not a lawyer. I like to say I'm not a lawyer, but I like to think I could play one on TV. I would like to try. But the reality is that over and across my work throughout the last couple of decades or so, a lot of that work has intersected in ways with the law or legal considerations in some way. And so I have dabbled, and you'll see that in some ways in some of the concepts, questions, et cetera, that I will bring up over the next few minutes. But I often start these talks with a little bit of confusion, even as I show up for a talk like this and get into the room. I typically have worn two hats as a scholar. One of those is as a historian and a historian of technology. The other as a social scientist. And those two different hats have often framed how I look at technology, and sometimes they dictate what I think is interesting, what I think is salient, and what my perspective and outlook is in terms of what should we be thinking about when it comes to a topic like AI, right? I also should probably say the caveat that I tend to be a extreme pessimist when it comes to technology, the future, et cetera. We can talk a little bit about why that is the case. But in recent months, I've tried to say I'm going to put my optimism hat on at least a little bit and try to have that come through. And I think for me, that does that well when opening up with a topic about AI and marginalized communities, and particularly starting with the image that you see on the screen, which is, of course, partly my dabbling with ChatGPT. This is an output of AI and marginalized communities. It was probably the 10th or 12th one that resulted from various types of prompts. And we can come back to that later because there's a lot of, I think we could probably spend the whole time just deconstructing this image to talk about things like generative AI and others. So there's a lot there. We could come back to it. I wanted to use it as a way to start to say and talk about the ways that I have begun to engage with generative AI in particular, which is to say quite a bit. When ChatGPT first came out, I started engaging with it, really having long conversations about race. Just out of fun, that was what was on my mind, and I wanted to see what types of outputs would come from the different inputs, questions, and responses, and so forth that I did as I was interacting. I've done a lot with as you can see, the text-to-image generation, and trying to understand how images are generated and the complexities around prompting, either refining or various ways of shaping and understanding the images that come out as outputs in relationship to the inputs that I have put in. Writing letters, movie scripts even, that I've tried to do, which I found actually works really well. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing, given some of our conversation earlier. And much of this is a way not so much to do work for me, or me thinking about these as a tool that I might utilize, though I do so in sort of my everyday work in some small ways, but really to try to understand what's at the root of generative AI, whether we're talking about chatbots or some of the things that I've mentioned, to identify what seems to me to be patterns or biases or what have you, and try to really interrogate the things that I see coming out as outputs. When I dabble in it to do things like writing code or other things, part of it is also thinking about that, the training data, ultimately that we are interrogating, and what is built upon the massive amounts of data that have gone in to build these systems. So I do all this and spend an inordinate amount of time kicking the tires on a lot of these things, really to try to understand what makes it tick, what makes it work, where there are errors. This is the one thing that very early on I found out just on my own, which is, of course, when you're trying to use it for your everyday work, understanding that it is not perfect, of course, or anywhere close to perfect. And so asking it to produce things and then reading through what it produces, which looks very, very, very good, and then saying, yet it's all wrong, right? And so often we have people who move ahead with the output without looking at the potential for error that is replete within these systems. So what I want to do today really is to give you a little bit of a sense of largely what concerns me when we think about AI, when we think about generative AI, et cetera. So what are some of the things that have been on my mind? And again, back to the hat that I'm wearing, the social scientist, the historian, the optimist, the pessimist, et cetera, what to foreground in terms of order, and what to sort of leave to the end. But I think I've come and settled on that order. So really the purpose for me today is to really just give you a little bit of insight into some of the questions that are motivating where I'm looking, what I'm looking at, and why things have drawn my interest or concerned me in one way or another, and really set things up for what I hope can be very robust Q&A. I was promised that you all were a group that has a lot of questions, and so maybe talk a little bit less and open things up for questions, which is always my preferred way of operating. All right. So we'll start here with the question of discrimination. When I think about AI and what's on my mind in terms of concerns, this is the thing that is often front and center. And so some of what you see here comes from an article that came out maybe a year or so ago that I published called Algorithmic Discrimination, a Framework and Approach to Auditing and Measuring the Impact of Race-Targeted Digital Advertising. So let me give you a little background and tell you a little bit about where this comes from. Then we'll focus for a moment on these bullets that I have here, and then move on to the next one. So I've had a long-standing professional interest in working in the area of housing discrimination. And a lot of that came from around about 2010, 2012 or so, and then beyond that, primarily being asked to be an expert witness on 2 or 3 landmark cases around reverse redlining. How many of you have heard that concept before, reverse redlining? Okay, so redlining, we sort of know the ways in which various types of lines, lenders, et cetera, were drawn to exclude people from gaining access to housing, access to neighborhoods, financing, all those kinds of things. So the idea of reverse redline is basically the opposite. Some people have referred to it as predatory inclusion or simply racial targeting. That is, I'm not looking to exclude you, I'm looking to find and target you. And typically the concern about racial targeting is that I'm typically trying to find and advertise and market something to you that is harmful in some way. Right? And so that was the nature of these cases that came to be and that I was asked to be an expert witness on, primarily in the realm of both the lending aspect and the advertising. So what was happening was large financial companies coming in with mortgage products that were largely predatory, right? High interest, high rates of potential default, so on and so forth. And what they did, often using something like the Community Reinvestment Act as a sort of a motivating cover for this, targeted Black and Hispanic neighborhoods to advertise these products in, and almost exclusively did so. And so what I was asked to do was to review and opine on all of the marketing and advertising strategies that these financial services companies used to target and to advertise. So this was, again, 2012, 13, 14 or so. We're still largely in the realm of non-digital advertising, right? Traditional advertising channels, television, print, et cetera, looking at things like rate sheets that people use to determine where they want to place their ads on a television show, looking at how much was spent on a given ad, on a given channel, on a particular day, and to use that data to try to infer about who the company was trying to target. And that was my task as a witness. And so there were a lot of things that came to play in the drama of doing that work, ranging from doing the expert analysis to the deposition to trial, et cetera. Questions I think that were germane both to that case when it comes to the idea of targeting, but then also in terms of what we think of about harms, so on and so forth. At the same time, as we're starting to get around 2015, 16, 17, you start to see the rise in what some of you may be familiar with, some of the what ended up being landmark suits and settlements of Facebook, Google, some other platforms that were taken to task for using their platforms to allow advertisers to target any of their services. That might be employment, it might be housing, a variety of factors. And so what these platforms were doing was selling advertisers, and in doing so, or selling advertising opportunities, allowing people to come in, if I'm trying to sell a home, and say, here's the audience that I want to include to potentially sell this home to. And it was a variety of demographic data, including race, gender, et cetera. And so it could be that people wanted to use those to include, but more often than not, it was to exclude audiences on the basis of these protected categories. And so in both of these cases, both the ones that I talk about that I was involved in, and then the sort of transition to the digital advertising market, online advertising systems, in these first couple of cases, things were still fairly easy and explicit, right? It was easy to go to Facebook and appear as an advertiser or be an advertiser and see the categories that were listed. And they were very concrete. And so to say, I'm trying to target X and here's what I'm trying to sell, wasn't too difficult of a task, right? And so the idea of trying to unmask who the targets are, and then trying to go the extra step of making and drawing the conclusion that the targeting is predatory because the product that's being sold is harmful or potentially harmful, and therefore, when exclusively targeted at one particular group, leads to potential or actual disparate harm or impact. All that to say that when we step from that point up until the present, we see something that is altogether much more complex. And so as the law begins to prevent such platforms from doing things like this very explicitly, we begin to see the growth in an algorithmically driven ad tech ecosystem that masks the full range of what's happening. Right? How many of you have come across ads as you're going across the internet and doing what you do? Yeah. They're everywhere. They're more and more, as it seems, in the last, in recent days and years and so forth. And I'm sure you, like me, and probably everyone else, has asked the question at some point in time, why did I get this ad? Right? Why am I getting an ad for women's shoes? Who knows what about me that maybe I don't know about myself, right? What's going on here? And part of that is because of what is a much more algorithmically driven, AI-driven advertising ecosystem that causes, for me, a lot of concerns when it has to do with questions of discrimination and the idea of trying to understand whether bad actors are discriminating on the basis of any of these or other protected categories. And so what I did in this particular paper was to try to model that in some way in a more or less modern, but probably already very old ad ecosystem that we're currently living in. And that is really to try to see if I could model some aspect or marshal some aspect of a kind of disparate impact analysis based on where people and companies were targeting their ads. And the example that I was using, the case, was around predatory payday lenders. And so I don't want to go too deep into the weeds of sort of what and how I did that, but essentially I was able to get access to data, advertising data, that allowed me to comb through a number of keywords that are used to serve up ads in this space for companies like these looking for customers who are looking for payday loans and related types of financial services, then see their impact on different communities, in this case using zip codes as proxies, which is increasingly something that we're not able to do, both because of the law that makes it not possible for places like Google and so forth to use zip codes explicitly in the work that they do in terms of online search, advertising, etc. How many of you remember maybe 5, 8, 10 years ago, you could do a geographical zip code based search and get differentiated results on Google? You could still do that today a little bit, but not quite explicitly. And part of that was, again, an outgrowth of that earlier intervention that said you cannot target people on the basis of race or facilitate that in terms of advertisers. And that was being done in part because of zip codes and the degree to which zip codes were a powerful proxy for race, given types of geographical segregation and so forth that are in play. So that was the study. What came out of it were some critical questions for me in this realm, but I think that carry over when we're talking about the issue of harm in AI. So here are the questions. How should we define the problem of racial targeting? I'll skip over that one for now. The next three were really important for me. That is, how do we identify and define discriminatory targeting in this current complex advertising ecosystem? And so if we look, I'll give you just a little bit of a picture here. On the left hand, what you see are a number of key technology software, usually, that are used in the practice of digital advertising. Usually on the source side, that is, people who are doing advertising in some way. Many of these are algorithmically built, utilize AI, various types of AI systems to operate. And this is just one component of that complex ad ecosystem that we work with. The other part of that is a whole other area that's completely invisible, which is the ad auction system, right? And so in part what happens when you want to do advertising online is to put your ad in with a lot of other people who have and want to do advertising, and you bid for space. And this is not me standing in front of an auction house saying, me, this one, 200, 300, that kind of thing. It is an automated, algorithmically driven system that determines whose ad gets placed where, when, why, and on the basis of what data. All of those things are completely black boxed. Both black boxed in terms of our access to the underlying data that would allow us to audit, track, understand the disparate impact it might be having. And frequently, it is black boxed to the companies themselves. That is, when you would ask them, if you were to ask them to explain the algorithms behind the ad auction system, they cannot tell you exactly what and how it's making the decisions that it's making. And so again, the concern for me is, how then do we track and understand the potential and possibility for discrimination in this way? How do we audit? How do we keep folks accountable for potential harms that may come about as a result? Okay, on the number 2 area of concern, things that I think a lot about, is this question about participation and power, and really participation versus power. So for about the last year and a half, actually, let me step back. Many of you might be familiar with the Chips and Science Act, which was recent legislation that really was designed to help propel the United States win the technology race, essentially. One of the things that it did was to create a new directorate in the National Science Foundation which leads science, innovation, et cetera, throughout the country, and created this new directorate called Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. The purpose of this new directorate was really to begin to, on a large scale, fund the kinds of research, technology transfer, and translation projects that happen that bring new technologies to market and really advance that across the United States and beyond. One of the things that this new agency did that I think was right and that was particularly advantageous from its beginning was to be created at a time when there are a lot of folks in the administration that says, all right, before we really go full steam on doing the work for which this new directory was created, let's ask ourselves some questions, right? When we're thinking about innovation, and AI innovation in particular, what do we mean by increasing participation? Which was one of the parts of both the legislation and the articulated mission of this new directorate. It is to diversify who's involved in innovation, who's able to capitalize on innovation, and how we think about innovation and development in ways that are not only usable and produce things that are good for us and ways for us to accomplish certain tasks, but ways that are ethical, ways that respond to the diversity of communities that exist as both users and developers. And really the question was, how do we really drive technology and AI innovation in ways that don't produce products and systems that have harm or disparate harms to certain communities built into it. And so these were a number of concerns that animated the directorate. And for the last year and a half or so, one of the things that I've had the good fortune to be able to do, along with a number of colleagues, is to work on a working group to help advise this new directorate about these questions. What does it mean to participate? If any of you have ever been part of a grant call, and particularly for something like National Science Foundation, there's always a category in there that you have to talk about in terms of broadening participation. And that's usually about marginalized communities and groups. And what has historically happened is the idea of broadening participation has been exactly what you think it means. Very surface in terms of participating, right? It might mean simply that I'm a user and I dabble and do things. It might be that occasionally I answer some questions on a survey, right? And that counts as meaningful participation in AI and technology innovation. Sometimes it means something different, which is innovation that starts from a developer from a community of color, let's say, or underserved community. And what gets developed ultimately does not come to be. I'll be a little bit implicit in some of my wording, right? So that what happens in the innovation ecosystem at some point is that there is interest and there is participation and deep participation in AI innovation. But depending on who you are and where you are as an entrepreneur, as a developer, et cetera, a lot of that determines where your innovations go, how successful you might be, the access to capital to bring this to fruition, so on and so forth. All of this to say that the question, or one of the questions that has been important to me is really, as we think about how AI is going to change significantly our future, and we think about marginalized communities and our relationship to these new innovative tools, systems, etc., what will that relationship be? How is it that our communities, marginalized communities, meaningfully participate, contribute to, benefit from, profit from AI innovation? These are the questions, some of the questions that keep me up at night. And for one of the questions, just to give you a little bit of sort of insight into some of the discussions that happened in this group over the year or so that we continued with it, came down to this question about power and really changing the language around innovation to talk less about mere or token participation and talk more about what it means to ask the question, how do marginalized groups gain power in a new innovation economy or an AI economy? How do we move from thinking about people in our community simply as users who participate in the tool itself, but not really having that actual benefit or the possibility to gain monetarily or otherwise from it? And so again, NSF is a research enterprise. And so a lot of what we discussed were, what does it mean for teams of researchers who might be going to develop a new AI project, do so in collaboration with a community? What does that look like? Who gets to decide? Is it the expert PhDs and engineers who actually have the capacity to build the things that will become the tool? What role does that community play, particularly if they don't have a particular set of expertise that traditionally is seen as expertise for these groups of folks? Who decides who has the power, control, who benefits? And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to really help to define some of the critical questions that would have to be raised and put on the table for researchers, for developers, for other people who are getting funds to play and work in this developmental framework that says you need to be required to show to us that you can work with an indigenous tribe to build a new tool in which they have some sense of ownership, decision-making power as it's being built, and therefore mitigating the potential or actual risk of harm when that tool is built. And some of this was laying out a long set of processes where members of communities, in conjunction with folks that are getting funded and doing these developments, are in part going through an actual specific set of decision-making processes that are explicit, that are public and articulatable, that says who gets to make the decisions, who has ownership over what part of these decisions, who's gonna be responsible for just getting or giving input, when do we need to make some type of, let's say, contract about intellectual property, who profits and how when this tool goes to market. And so being very much deliberate about that process of how we say we want to work together in and with and for and by communities, particularly marginalized communities, to be able to innovate and build AI systems that are and have a overall public good and not produce harm. How am I doing on time? I'm sorry, I always lose. Oh, I've got here.
106.
Okay. We're good on time still? Okay. I'm gonna quickly go to the last thing that I will bring up and then we'll open it up for questions. Sorry, let's see. I'm gonna say a quick word about this, but then I think I'm gonna go on to this next one as a way of wrapping up. The question of representation. It seems like, at least in a lot of the circles that I run in and so forth, you bring up representation and people are like, yeah, right? But it matters, right? Who is there? Who makes a decision? And so when I'm thinking about AI, and you can notice in the way that I've done this talk, that sort of zooms out from thinking about the technological parts of it itself, the hardware, the software, all those things, out to some broader level questions that I think actually are probably more important for us to grapple with and engage with, and this is one of them, around representation. What you see here on the screen is an excerpt from, I think it's the very first hearing of the EEOC held in 1967 in New York City. And then on the right, you see a press release that came out about a week ago from the EEOC. Both of them say the same thing. That is, in the tech workforce, and in 1967 it was tech workforce and more, we seem to have an inability, A, to hire workers who are from marginalized communities, and we're practically at zero in representation of people from marginalized communities in the rungs of leadership and control in private sector organizations, right? 67 to 2004, and essentially, I would argue, nothing has changed in that respect, right? And so the reason that I am concerned often about representation is because when I think about where we are today in terms of AI and a long list of computational technological advances and where it has left us and where it has disproportionately harmed marginalized group, communities of color, et cetera, it's largely because of what was the case in this 1967 observation. It was that the people who should be represented at all stages of this process, ranging from people who are developing technologies at our universities and in our labs, to private sector companies where these things go to then be marketed commercially and adopted at a wider scale, to people who are in positions in those companies to say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to make and build, or more importantly, in my mind, to say the opposite, which is we're not going to do that, right? If that had been the case in 1967, I would dare say that we wouldn't find ourselves in the way that we have today in terms of all of the negative effects that technology has wrought on our society. And so what concerns me today is that those types of representation are still not in place today as we're staring down the barrel of a new AI revolution that's going to move quicker, at greater scale, and if we don't have people who are able to represent the concerns, the interests, et cetera, of all of our communities, then almost by necessity and by fiat, we were going to land in something that at the very best will be a mirror of where we are today, and likely at worst, much more exponentially worse off than we are given the capability and powers of this technology. So I think what I'll do is to start to wrap up here, right? And this is the historian's hat. This is also the pessimistic hat. But I think the hat that we have to really grapple with. This is the book that I wrote that came out back in 2019. Black software that turned into a history of Black people's relationship to computing technology. It was profoundly impactful to me as a researcher and then writing the book and so forth. But the ultimate conclusion of it is that no matter how much attention we put to trying to audit algorithms or determine new AI systems and how they impact folks to try to de-bias systems, so on and so forth, we will always come up short. if our only focus is on the tool itself. Because that tool, as it did in 1965 and 1960 when computers first came into dominance, comes into dominance at a historical moment where there is already a fabric of our culture, society, etc., that runs counter to interests of things like equity and so forth. And so it was no surprise to me, though it was surprising writing this book and finding some of the things I found, that the first thing that we would use computing software and tools to do would be to surveil communities of color, let's say. The first technological computer tools that we built were built to police Black communities primarily. That's part of the subject of the book. And then the cautionary tale is, if we don't attune ourselves to the question centrally of race, equity, and more importantly, power in these questions about AI development, we're simply doomed to repeat history. There's a whole lot more I want to say, but I suppose I don't have the next 2 hours. So I'm going to stop there, invite some questions for the time that we have left. Thank you.
Would you like me to manage the queue, or would you like to do it yourself?
I would love for you to. That would be great.
Okay. Do we have any questions?
Hi. So thank you. So enjoyed your presentation. I was thinking back to your conversation about how to infuse sort of power, questions of power into the NSF grant. And I guess my question is, what about the question of whether you want the technology in the first place, right? So like with NSF, obviously they're funding people who are going to be building the technology. But what about the question, how do we begin to grapple with the question of, do we want technology to be our solution, or are there other ways? How do you think that sort of fits into what you're thinking about?
Yeah, it's a great question, and is a big part of that question about AI and marginalized communities and how we work together. Because the recognition is precisely as you say, right? Anyone who's an academic, anyone who's written a grant in this room will be familiar with this situation. I write a grant, and about 15 days before that grant is due, I call someone, let's say they're from Black Community Development Organization. Hey, I need a partner, can you sign on? I'll tell you later what it's about. Just say yes, right? So all of that is backloaded, right? Without giving community partners the option to start much earlier to even say, is this something we want or need, right? And that's usually the first question. And so part of what our advice has been and will continue to be is, when we think about research and partnerships and development in this space, that we need to build in time for meaningful trust building and conversation with communities, right? And this is one of those complex things where, this is a federal agency, they do grants, they have a cycle, it's time bound. And I recall being in one of the meetings and one of the program officers saying, well, how long does it take to build trust? And it was an interesting question. My social science hat sort of went up first, and I was like, I'm sure we could quantify that in some way. But really the answer was, you know what? You don't really know. It might be a day, it might be a month, it might be 5 years. But doesn't take long to lose it. So how do we want to reorder and make sure, or at least protect ourselves in some way from making the types of errors that come from, let's say, breaches of trust in some way, by not asking the question and not asking the right question at the right time, which often is that one. Do we need this? Do we want this? And do we want it here and for us? And for me, that gets to a lot of the stuff of the no that comes or doesn't usually come later down in the process. And we end up investing a lot of time, effort, and money on stuff that later on people did not want or ask for and can't use. And then in worst cases are harmful because it is taken up and we've never asked the question, should we use this? And if the answer is yes, how? And how do we build it? And so I think all those questions were the things that we advised and said, we've got to make somehow some space to be able to do that if we're serious about involving marginalized communities in this process.
Other questions?
I thought this was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
I want to sort of get your thoughts on representation, right? And when I saw that, I was like, well, representation with an asterisk, I guess, right? Because you think about representation in many other contexts. I think about the criminal law context. I can think about policing, representation, and that not fundamentally changing the way that police operate in Black communities, Black and brown communities. So, wanted to push back a little bit, or get you to invite you to sort of expand on that more, because you're arguing that we'd be in a different place if earlier in the process we see more representation. And I'm not sure. So I don't.
No, it's a great question. It's a great question. And what the short answer would be is that I see this as a necessary condition, but not sufficient one. So that's really it. And it's the caveats. And the first, I don't know, half of my career was spent working on political campaigns and electoral systems, right? And in that case, political scientists have a concept for different types of representation, typically descriptive and substantive, right? The first one is there's a Black person in a district made up mostly of Black people, right? So that representation mirrors representative constituency. The substantive is, do things change as a result, right? Is the idea that the substantive aspects of policy, of interest, et cetera, change in terms of those representatives' advocacy and so forth, because they represent or mirror the demographics of the community. And there's been a lot of evidence to show that there's a great gap often between those two things. I think we haven't even gotten to the place where we can conjecture or have the luxury of making a distinction between those things in the world of tech, because we simply have not had that level of representation at all. But ultimately what I think I'm getting at is thinking about representation in a much more radical and revolutionary way, right? Which is the idea of, let's think about a future where, Yvonne was gone, but think about Atlanta, that has a number of HBCU institutions, large Black population, et cetera. Lots of tech companies increasingly becoming a tech hub. What at the start of AI innovation began there, where all of the folks that are represented in that ecosystem were also represented in all of the different areas that have input in this innovation process, which come from both public and private sector, government, the tech companies, your higher education institutions, so on and so forth. How would the questions be different? might they be different? And if so, how would that impact what comes later? So the push to think about representation is more to think about sort of the revolutionary opposite to what has been the case in the tech sector up to this point. But also to have someone in power at any point in time who might simply say, I understand the landscape of potential harms of this technology on these particular communities, and I'm gonna say, no, we're out, right? And I think that's very powerful and necessary, even if the ideal in those situations are not really the case.
Yes, I want to follow up on the last two questions, because I'm very interested in this idea of representation and power. And Jessica had kind of framed it in terms of, when does a community get to say, we don't need that, we don't want that. But I'm wondering if we can push this idea of power back further. Power is about agenda setting.
Right.
And when does, or how do you get these companies to go to a community and say, is there a use of this technology that would help you? And I think of an example from near where I live, where there was an officer involved in a shooting. And it turns out he had been dismissed by a number of police departments, right? Like, it seems like there are ways to use this technology that could help marginalized communities. But part of it is they have to be part of the agenda setting process. So I don't know if that was something that you covered. And again, NSF, they're all about funding the people who make this stuff,
Yes.
right? So how do you kind of unknot that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's precisely one of the largest sort of levers of power to say, here's what we're gonna do and here's what we're not gonna do. Or here's what we're gonna pay attention to and set out to discover. And so I think that it's really in the advice of, again, that sort of revolutionary thing, which I don't think NSF is gonna adopt. But it is to say, we have to have the starting points much earlier and thinking about a scenario where things start at that level, right? You identify what a community might largely see as a problem or an issue, right? And so let's just say we start there. And having a way and a structure to be able to have meaningful conversation in that community about what the problem is, all right? If we have some consensus about that, what do we do about it? And do we want to do anything about it? And then have a process that begins from there. One of the things that we talked about with NSF about doing is creating the circumstances that allow that to happen. For instance, to give researchers funds that say, for 2 years, you can go sit in a community and don't do anything that involves building a piece of software or hardware, but asking questions and engaging with the community, right? And so part of it was, you have a mission as an agency to do innovation, and we've typically considered the outputs of that as the innovations and not the inputs. And so let's focus attention and provide some incentives on the inputs. And then part of what that does is to say, there's some expertise here that are also a set of expertise that are traditionally locked out of these developmental processes. And some of that is already starting to change with NSF and others, making it much easier to partner with a nonprofit in a community and that money to go straight to the nonprofit and not get filtered through a higher education institution, for instance. So I think it's things like that, but it's really trying to change the culture of innovation and who's included, and to push that process earlier and provide the incentives, i.e. the funds, to be able to do that in the same way.
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for your time and your invaluable insights. My name is Andrea Valderrama, and I'm a pre-law undergraduate student at the University of Richmond. And your points about participation and representation really resonated with me, because what I found is it's kind of a cyclical problem, and I can only speak to the Hispanic community, but oftentimes people don't want to participate in spaces where the Hispanic community is underrepresented because there is that lack of representation. So in your opinion, how do you fix that problem of low representation when people don't want to participate because there's low representation?
Maybe it's the undergraduate students that ask the hardest questions. It's difficult because what you have to do is you have to ask people to take risks, right? So you have to ask people to take risks, but I think when I confront that issue a lot in the domains that I do, it is making it a little bit easier for folks to take those risks. And doing that means trying to build a community in which they can do that, or a support system in which they can do that. I would say I do that much more in the hat that I wear that is higher education leader and administrator and so forth. But this happens frequently with faculty when we're recruiting, right? Want to diversify the faculty in this department. How do I ask someone to come in and be the only Hispanic person in an all-white department? Hard to do, but it becomes a little bit easier if you say, all right, you're going to do this, and you've got my ear and support, and there are some folks across the university in other departments that also sort of have your back, and I'm going to connect you and so forth, and you build a kind of community that allows them to participate, still with some risk there, but also with a kind of level of support. And then I think ultimately what you have to be able to do is to show some success from that model to be able to say, you know, this is going to be worth the risk. The other is to just try to get more than one person to get a big group to participate at the same time, and say, hey, let's share this risk together. But often I think when we look at entrepreneur circles, particularly entrepreneurs of color, when they're successful, what they say is a big part of their success, and when they're not successful, what they often say has been missing is that community, right? I can always find the tools of how to do the thing I'm wanting to do. I can't always find that range of support that helps me take the kinds of risks that I need to get where I'm going.
Thank you for the question. I think you said you're an undergrad at the University of Richmond.
Yes.
I'm glad you found your way to Duke Law. I hope you will come back.
Thank you, too.
You have your hand up?
I was just thinking, maybe not quite related to that, but I'm from Austria, I'm an international law student, so I was thinking just about the companies and that a lot of women might not be represented in a higher level on the, for example, the board of directors. So how we deal in Austria is we pass laws saying that if the company is big enough, let's say starting with 50 employees or 500, there is like a quota. And then those positions need to be filled with females, for example, or other marginalized groups. It's a start, I think, maybe, because there will be some people in those groups, although they don't have the community, that will want to take the chance. Maybe that's a start, and then maybe more people will participate, and there will be a community with time. I don't know.
Yeah, it's very good. I think it's a great strategy. You know, I'll let the lawyers in the room to talk about the myriad of challenges and history that we have with quotas across the employment and other sectors, et cetera. So it becomes, for me, a way to, you know, how do we do things like that without saying we're doing things like that? Which is sort of one trick when legally or by policy or practice, you're not able to say, look, you're going to do X. I had one of our former presidents at my institution, we had a conversation once about hiring and diversity and so forth. And the point that he was making was, it's hard for academic institutions, or basically faculties, to do something like this, like let's say, hey, we're going to diversify our faculty, and therefore, as we search and recruit and bring people in, we're going to pay attention to that composition. You can't, because faculties work on, some version of consensus decision-making, other words that we could put to that. But the point he was making is, I'm a president, I have a staff, I can by fiat say we're gonna hire X, Y, and Z and just do it, right? And so I think the tension between those two things is in part, part of the challenge of representation when we identify the need to diversify certain rungs, have ways to fill those positions with people who are traditionally haven't been a part of them, but have to grapple with all kinds of structures, legal, cultural, and others that prevent us from doing that sort of in a direct way.
Mark?
There.
Yeah, just so thank you for this day. My name is Jared Chuckins. I'm in law. I'm in technology, actually. I work for Fidelity Investments. Great presentation. There was one section of it that really stood out to me, which was the comparison between where we were in 1966 and where we are today. And the fact that fundamentally, not a lot has changed.
Right.
So I guess my question to you would be, what recommendations or what suggestions do you think could be made to organizations about how they can do things differently to actually, have a difference, create a difference? Because we've been doing something. I mean, companies have been doing lots of things in the span of 50 years, and we always hear about, there's been a lot of progress made. There's been a lot of progress made. But specifically in the tech space, I mean, I've been in tech for over 3 decades, and it's just about the same as when I started. When I think about marginalized groups of people who look like me, actually being in the tech space and walking into the company and looking around and going, oh wait, there's one more of me in a room of 300. So what sort of things could companies do to actually, again, increase their numbers of folks within tech that are from marginalized communities?
Yeah, that's a hard question, because historically what we've seen is that a lot of companies have tried a lot of things, right? I will say, in my observation, what has been missing is a kind of sustainability, right? If I look at IBM, and this book ends up being kind of a de facto history of IBM in some ways, as a tech company being the major player in the early 1960s. I mean, there's a way in which they have built a playbook around diversifying an industry. But what you see is that there are fits and starts, and practices happen here, and then 3 years later, either you have a new president or what have you who says, we're going to take the company a different way. And so it's been that lack of sustainability, all the way to the point of, these companies. I think Microsoft has them in some versions now. IBM has had them in New York. They're called P-Tech schools. They're high schools in which industry and the company collaborate to help students gain entry to that industry, but in theory, to gain a leg up, and so on a track towards some, leadership types of rungs and so forth as they're coming into the industry. And I think the overall assessment is that those have all failed because, they start in a flash, and you got your photo ops, and you've said we're going to do all the good things, and everybody treats it as simply PR, and then 2, 3, 10 years later, the board doesn't really invest in it anymore, and so forth. So I think the missing thing is the first thing I would say is to companies, look through the litany of things that you have already done and tried, or that other companies have done successfully and tried, and just keep doing them and institutionalize them within the company. Easier said than done, right? As we're facing a time where everybody's jettisoning all their programs and so forth because of not just legal prohibitions, but out of fear of what might be. When the law hasn't simply said you can't do X, but they're saying, well, this probably 5 or 10 years later is gonna get me in trouble, so I'm gonna stop this now, which I see as simply being a way to not do something that they were never invested in the first place. So I think that's really my answer for what companies can do inside that company. The other thing I would say is to try to support more and more folks who are in those industries to go out and do their own thing and build their own thing. And I think that's ultimately, at the end of the day, the only track that we have. There was a discussion that came up with one of the earlier presenters around generative AI and looking at the training data and the representative or non-representative nature of that, and then asking the question, should we participate, right? Should our communities take our data that we produce in various ways and make it part of these, and so we can build new tools that are reflective of and responsive to us? Or do we run the risk of what might happen in those cases, which is that is exploited or that it is used to harm us in some other ways, which has been, of course, the history of our society in large part. So it's not easy, that conundrum, but it's one of the only ways, I think, out. And I think that one of the things that puts me on a little bit of an optimistic path in this area is to see more and more people who are doing that. This last weekend, I was in DC at a conference that was called the Black AI Joy Symposium, right? Were any of you there? Okay, gotcha. And it was amazing. Fallon Wilson, and this was an NSF-funded project, and I'm on her advisory board for that in terms of the NSF-facing parts of it. And she was asking me, what did I think of it? And I said, I thought it was fantastic because what it did was, in part, reorder what I think our priorities should be, right? So we spent the whole first 3 hours of the first day of the event that was all cultural, artistic production with the backdrop of AI. But really, let's talk about us, let's talk about community, interest, culture, what we produce, not our deficits, but the things that we create and have power over. And then we'll talk about AI at some point. But what's really important is the centering of us, right? And I think in large part, that's the message I like to leave in these kinds of discussions, which is to say, ultimately, that reorienting of power is about who's given power and agency as we think about this relationship between human beings and these AI tools. And the tendency has been to say, we can fix the tools, right? And this is the hubris of, folks I meet, colleagues, well-meaning, when I go over to the engineering department or computer science, and I was like, we can fix that bias problem. Can you really? Especially when you really don't know much about actually the history and experience and so forth of bias and discrimination and so forth. But folks that see this as a computational problem and project, and if we treat it that way, we will continue to see the same kinds of things we've always seen. That was a very long answer to your.
How many additional questions do we have? Maybe we can get them all on the floor, you can choose.
Sounds good.
Go ahead, at the very back, yeah.
Oh, sure, thanks. Thank you for your presentation. You started out, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so I just don't have a framework.
That's right.
And I'm in human development and family studies. And so when you started with the sort of comedic question of how many of us have had random advertisements come across our laptops or whatever we were on, and you mentioned that about shoes. The first thing I thought is, how does AI impact this, or how is AI evolving, where it's beginning to possibly target some concept of family as unit or as audience, right? Because I said, well, maybe he's getting that particular advertisement because his wife, partner, or daughter ordered those shoes. My husband and I kid about that because I get things, I'm wondering why I'm getting them, but then I find out he purchased a fishing pole. So I'm curious as to, when you talk about this, you call it the algorithmic advertising ecosystem, how do you see it in the future, if you see it at all, and I'm asking for your social science hat, if you will, how does the family system become the target of this evolution, and what implications do you see it having for like family dynamics?
Wow.
So that's one.
Okay, yes, I get to choose.
Margaret, you saw your hand up as well.
Right.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring us back to the way in which we try to disentangle that relationship between race, equity, and power in your book through the power of narrative. And I thought that this is something that, especially in a law school, so much of the power of the law falls on that story. And wanted to invite you to help us think about that, especially since there are times when the law is the problem, and the law is not the solution. So the way the story can help us illuminate that.
Yeah, thank you for that question.
Are there any others?
I was curious if you have any sort of argument in favor of the business case for community development of AI tools. I feel like you made a really compelling moral argument, but curious kind of what the business case is. These other, predatory lenders would probably say the business case is to use these, tools destructively. But yeah, curious what the business case is for your argument.
All right.
And I have one.
Okay.
I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to misbehave, right? And take us beyond what you talked about today. Back to your first book, right? Which was Race Appeal, How Political Candidates Invoke Race in U.S. Political Campaigns. We're talking about AI. We're talking about marginalized groups. But then you have other groups using AI in this political moment, right? I'm thinking about Trump and Taylor Swift. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the racial dynamics of that. You don't have to go there.
Okay.
I said I was misbehaving,
Yep,
but
yep.
I could not resist. So you have three other questions that go to accountability, representation, and power. And then you have this road question.
Okay. I like the road question. It gives me a chance to talk about stuff I don't get an opportunity to as much. All right, so I think I'm gonna try to tackle them all and help me refresh my memory if I don't get it quite right. I'll start with the business case. I think what immediately comes to mind to me is simply private companies want to make money. In part, that is by a match between what I have to sell to you and your need for that product or propensity to use it. And so I think one purely business case for this is really thinking about the underlying motivation for those businesses, right? I'll give you an example of, I'll try to give you a hypothetical example. I was trying to think if I can give you an actual one, but I can't probably, without getting in trouble. It behooves a company who really wants to profit from the generative AI products that they are building, to understand how and why and in what cases the people they want to buy these tools and use them, how they will use them. And so if no other moral argument is there for this case, simply saying, I want to align my tools with the market and with users who will ultimately make the decision about whether this business of mine is profitable or not, behooves one to be deeply embedded with that community in a variety of ways. I think I can talk about meta a lot since it's been a long time. I don't care if they'll see me. In any case, many of you in the room probably who are professors, faculty, etc., have gone through this. I feel like for a long time, Meta, primarily when it was Facebook, would come and say, hey, can you come help us think about or through this problem? That was really about how do we match and work with users from these particular marginalized communities. Often those would be discussions that were product specific, right? We're rolling out a new tool. How should we be thinking about things like representation and equity when we're thinking about, let's say, a system of avatars that will be our primary way of engaging with each other in this space? And then very practical questions about what that should look like, what tools should be available, and how. It's set up as an equity question, but in reality, what they really want to know is, how do we align on these so that we have Black and Hispanic users use them and pay to use them in ways that they feel comfortable doing so. So my only real answer to your question in this short period of time is that as an example of a business case. I think if we look in, there's some stuff going on in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I have a connection to because of work that our university is doing there. But it's a prime example where there is a nonprofit organization called Black Tech Street, whose founder essentially said, I don't want my community to be left out of AI innovation. I come from historic Black Wall Street. I want to utilize AI tools and innovation to benefit and restore the stature of my community that was once here. And so here's how we're going to do that. And it has built starting to build an ecosystem that helps to do that. Their principal partners, Microsoft, right? And in part, I got to understand